American-born children who are being trafficked, right? When I say trafficked, I'm not talking about across state lines. You can be trafficked if you are being taken from your group home steps to the house across the street. You can be trafficked. I have worked with children that were trafficked within their apartment building. So, and actually this, for a little bit of context, is one of the reasons, this particular case is one of the reasons why I went to law school. I was working with a young woman who was charged with a robbery. She was 16. She had been in the system in the juvenile system for about 4 years, and no one had suspected trafficking, right? She had an IEP. Does anybody know what an IEP is? It's an individualized education plan. It is created by federal standards for children with special needs. So this is a child with special needs. This is a child that is not operating at the developmentally appropriate level of a 16-year-old. She's operating at about 11 or 12, okay? What we find out when we dig deeper into the robbery charge is that the person that she robbed was an 80-year-old man. The 80-year-old man had been her customer for 5 years. So for 5 years, her uncle had been sending her across the hall to clean his house. And he normally paid her a certain amount. He didn't pay her the amount that he usually paid her on this particular instance, so she waited till he fell asleep, and she took more money than he had given her. Most likely because she was afraid that she would show up back to her uncle, who was exploiting her, right? And was not a blood uncle. And that she would get in trouble for not bringing back enough money. The 80-year-old man called the police, and she was charged with robbery, right? We filed a child abuse report against this man and found out that he had a long history of abusing little girls, right? But because of the lack of system understanding, of first responder understanding about how trafficking works, this girl gets put into delinquency court and charged with robbery, right? The child abuse report for 5 years, apparently there had been like 6 reports filed against this guy, had been consistently unsubstantiated, right? Because children were not willing to come forward and give enough details for them to substantiate the claim, right? So when we talk about domestic child sex trafficking, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about kids who are getting involved or getting recruited into that lifestyle at very young ages that are usually under the control or influence of somebody older, regardless of whether they say and believe that they are doing it as a method of survival, which they may be doing, but that doesn't discount the fact that someone is exploiting the fact that they need to survive, right? But as I mentioned, around the country, because we don't have an appropriate or an informed response, which we've been working a lot to do, and our organization works a lot to do public education around this and education with lawmakers, is that these kids end up getting charged. They more often than not get charged with prostitution, although there are 15 states now that basically make children immune from prosecution for prostitution. DC is one of them as of 2014. You cannot be charged with prostitution if you are under the age of 18. However, you can be charged with other things, right? So if a law enforcement officer sees you walking down the street and it looks like that kind of situation, they can arrest you for running away. They can charge you with disorderly conduct, maybe, right? They can charge you with other things, which are what they call masking offenses, right? For us, this is sort of the pinnacle of examples of the sexual abuse to prison pipeline, because you are talking about kids who are defined under federal law as victims of a severe form of gendered violence, and yet our response is to arrest and detain the children. There are a lot of reasons for that. People are certainly coming around to the idea that these kids are victims. Where we are struggling a lot is how do you keep them safe? And getting people to understand that arresting and detaining and criminalizing that child actually not only further traumatizes them because of what you experience, which we'll talk about in a second, when you enter the system, but also because you're actually rendering them more vulnerable to be trafficked again, right? Because a trafficker is telling you, if you ask for help, if you go to the police, all they're gonna do is arrest you. If I'm 12 years old and I believe this person, and then I go to the police and they arrest me and do everything that he said, it reinforces this idea, one, that he's the only one that cares about me, right? And that two, he was right. He knows what's gonna happen. These people don't actually care about me, which makes it much harder for service providers to come in after that and build a relationship of trust and support that will allow that young person to exit that situation safely. So we talked about this. So in terms of, you're talking about girls that are coming into the system with all of these things, this now hopefully explains some of the behavior, right? They're going to be less likely to respect adults. Why? What have the adults in their lives been doing? Abusing or not protecting them, right? Or just not recognizing, not asking the right questions, which to them, to a kid, means you don't care, right? Like you don't care what's going on in my life. You've seen me go home with this person every day. You've never asked me what's going on, right? You never asked why I'm acting that way in class, right? They're going to have difficulty identifying safe and positive adults. If your first sexual or intimate encounter is with an adult, right? Or with someone who is supposed to protect and love you, then your conception of love and safety and protection is going to be influenced by that. You're going to think that that's how people that love you respond to you. I once worked with a girl who, and this happens a lot with abused children, but we had developed a great relationship of trust. She was calling me for help. We were helping get her back on the right track. She all of a sudden sort of became very sexualized in her responses to me because she didn't understand that you could have a non-sexual relationship with an adult who cared about you, right? That explains why some of that hypersexual behavior is happening. But the other thing is that girls are not necessarily acting in all of these ways, right? There are also mythologies. When we're talking about girls of color, there is data that shows that girls of color are hypersexualized, that stereotypes about race and gender play into our responses. So, for example, I was recently at an event that the DC Campaign for Teen Pregnancy put out about child abuse, right? And all of the young people that were there were students in DCPS, and they were talking about how they felt like their teachers looked at them funny when they started to develop, right? The boys even talked about how they noticed male teachers responding to, treating, speaking to female students differently once their bodies started to develop, right? So when you talk about push out, one of the major things is that girls of color, often their bodies develop differently. So when you're talking about dress codes or what is appropriate clothing for school, oftentimes girls of color are disciplined for wearing the exact same clothes that white girls are wearing because their bodies look different into it. And because the adults around them don't know how to control their impulses or can't recognize that it is through no fault of her own, that her body is responding that way, that's natural, and that should be a supportive and affirming environment rather than one that penalizes her for things that are out of her control, right? Oftentimes, attitudes towards communities and mothers, right? If I am a judge who is determining whether to send a girl back to her home, and I have my own stereotypes about the community that she comes from or the home or the parent, I may be less likely to send her home, right? So oftentimes it's out of a protection, right? There is a paternalism that plays into what our responses to girls are. Another reason, there's no data. It was very hard to write this report because there is very little data. That report, Gender and Justice, that I mentioned is one of the few places, and then a few years ago, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention launched the National Girls Initiative. The idea was really because it was recognized at the federal level that we need to collect more data on girls in the system so we can figure out what's going on. I will say that all of this, we're starting to get some data on girls in the juvenile justice system. There is literally one report out there that I know of that talks about girls in the adult system, right? So if we can imagine that there's no data about girls in our juvenile system when they're increasingly a larger percentage of our juvenile system, then we can imagine that there is little to no data about girls in the adult system. And then there is a refusal to prioritize. These are girls that we have already cast out. They are girls that we have refused to care about. They're the girls that we're pushing out of our schools. They're the girls in our foster care system, which we know is woefully under-resourced, whose lives we haven't prioritized. And then they're the girls who are committing delinquent acts. And we know, because of all of the work that we do, that those are not the sympathetic kids that people are going to respond to. So those are some of the reasons why it exists. And as I mentioned, girls of color are disproportionately impacted by some of these responses because whether you are seen as a victim or not has a lot to do with who you are and where you come from, right? And how society responds to you. Really quickly, in terms of what happens, if you're a girl who comes into the system and you're carrying all of this trauma, what other kinds of trauma can you experience when you're in the system? If I have experienced sexual violence or physical violence by someone who is larger or stronger than me, and all of a sudden I'm put into a situation where I'm shackled, where I'm confined in a room. If you're trafficked, maybe you've been confined in a room that you couldn't get out of, where people are doing invasive searches in a lot of places, unfortunately, because some places don't comply with PREA. Cross-gender searches are very common, right? There are loud noises, there is yelling. You may already be coming from environments where, particularly if you're trafficked, where you have no control over what you wear, when you eat, when you sleep. And that control is continued once you enter the system. If you are pregnant or parenting, in a lot of states, they still shackle girls, right? They shackle them even though there is ample data and research and evidence and best practices that have been put out that say that shackling at any point during pregnancy can cause harm to both the mother and the baby, right? DC has a pending juvenile justice bill right now. Last year they amended it to say that girls in their third and maybe second trimester can't be shackled. This bill, the newest version, would say any child any child really shouldn't be shackled unnecessarily, right? That the use of shackles is a human rights violation, right? And that it's unnecessary in most cases. But oftentimes a girl is not going to know or even report that she's pregnant, right? So if I was just raped right before I came into intake and the person who raped me did not use protection, I may be pregnant and not know it, right? And so they could be inadvertently causing harm to me, putting my baby at risk potentially, and not giving me all of the information and access to information that I need to make an informed decision about what I'm going to do in that situation, right? So there are solutions, I promise. One of them is really to pay attention, to ask questions, to look at knowing what we know about child abuse, about sexual abuse. How can we tailor our systems to, one, ensure that children that don't need to be there are not there, right? The contention among most of the organizations that are in this room actually is that there are a ton of kids in our juvenile system that should not be there, and that for those kids that do need to be there or will find themselves there for more seriously violent offenses, we should ensure that our system is appropriately responsive to them, right? That gives them an opportunity to get the services that they need. And so this is just sort of National Child Traumatic Stress Network put out some guidelines on what it looks like for a system to be trauma-informed. Everybody's throwing around this, we need a trauma-informed juvenile justice system. There isn't clarity on what exactly that looks like, but the idea is that whatever that system looks like, it takes into these factors into account. So, sorry, I don't know what happened. Well, we can stop there with the, basically there are, let's see, what happened? Okay. Well, basically, I'll really quickly talk about the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act and the provisions that are in there, and one other campaign that our organization has, and then we'll open it up for questions. So the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, the JJDPA, is the only piece of federal legislation that really regulates or create some standards for state juvenile justice systems, right? And it basically says if you don't do these things, then you can't get federal funding, or your ability to get federal funding will be impacted. It also says that we encourage you to do these other things, right? So there are a bunch of very important provisions in the newest version of the bill, which passed out of the Senate committee last summer, and which many organizations here are doing a lot of advocacy to push through. The important provisions for girls are: one, it requires screening, particularly for trafficking, but also for trauma, right? And the idea is if you are screened for being trafficked, that you are theoretically diverted away from the system